Welcome to The Moderate Catholic. I am your host, Christina Gebel, and this is episode 12 in our second season of Radical Family, International Service as a Family. So welcome everyone back to season 2. I am thrilled to be here today with two very good friends who have made bold choices in living out their faith as a family. Both are medical doctors, Dr. Ann Berry and Dr. George Stablein. And while that is their professional title, I affectionately know them as Ann and George. And we have a lot of really cool overlaps in our life. But I'm going to let them introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about who you are in the here and now, who your kids are, how old are they, and then we'll jump into this amazing choice that you made as a family.
Thanks, Christina. Very exciting to be here with you too. I'm Ann. I am a family doctor and also have a second specialty in preventive medicine. And our kids are Susanna and Louisa. And Susanna is 15 and a freshman in high school. And Louisa is 12 and she is in 6th grade.
And I am George Stablein. I am a community pediatrician in the area, and that's my only specialty.
It's good. It's a good specialty. So
Thank you.
Having it is great. So we have had some interesting overlaps, and I officially met Ann and George at the commissioning ceremony for Maryknoll lay missioners. And could one of you start us off by just telling us 10,000 foot view? What is Maryknoll?
Maryknoll is a hill in New York, in Westchester County, named after Mary on the Knoll. And that is where the Maryknoll priests and Maryknoll sisters both have their headquarters. And those are orders of Catholic priests and sisters that their kind of focus is service in different countries. And then Maryknoll lay missioners grew out of both the Maryknoll priests and Maryknoll sisters. It started off that they invited lay people to come in service alongside them in different countries where they were serving. And then over time, that grew into a formal lay service program. And then that over time grew into its own separate organization, which is still very closely affiliated with, always partnering together with both the Maryknoll priests and the Maryknoll sisters in New York and all over the world. But it is its own separate organization where lay Catholics like us can serve in different countries.
Awesome. Yeah, I actually didn't know the fact about the hill, so that is something I learned today. I didn't know that it was actually a knoll, so that's good. Mary on the knoll. Okay.
Yeah.
I love that. So we met at this commissioning ceremony in Austin, New York, and I didn't officially know you before that, despite the fact that Ann did the same residency program as my husband, although prior to his being there. Tell me a little bit about your lives before you officially got to Maryknoll lay missioners. Like, what was happening in your life? What were some things that led you to that path?
It really started like before I even met George, when I was a volunteer with Jesuit Volunteers International at the time, JVI, in Managua, Nicaragua. And I did that after I graduated from college, but before I went to medical school. And while I was there was when I first learned about Maryknoll. There was a community of Maryknoll sisters. My Jesuit volunteer community made a retreat one time at the Maryknoll sisters community, and they were wonderful and lovely. And while I was there during the 2 years I was in Managua, through the Ben Linder community of like international volunteers and like faith-based volunteers and people working in faith-based organizations, I met a married couple who had young children, and they had also previously been with Maryknoll. They weren't at the time when I met them, but that's how I first learned about that. And I also met another family that was not with Maryknoll. I think they were with the Mennonite Central Committee But they were also from the US, and they also had young children, and were living in Nicaragua and living there with their young children. So it was really those two families especially that I always really admired them and just thought, oh, that's such a great thing that they're here, not just like me. Oh, I'm just here for 2 years. Before I then go back to my regular life kind of thing. But they were doing this as like their regular life, and their kids were there and they were living there and growing up there. So that kind of planted that idea in my mind. And I, from that time, always had a dream to one day be a Maryknoll lay missioner. And especially I thought if I ever do end up having a family and having kids, I would definitely want to do that.
And Ann and I met in medical school in Hershey, Pennsylvania, Penn State. When we were early on in dating, we had a conversation one night, and Ann said, if you are interested in us being a long-term couple, just know that I'm going to be living internationally again someday. And so consider yourself forewarned. I was going to be the small town pediatrician going back to my home area where I grew up, just what I had always envisioned for myself. And so then there was a part of me that was, oh, maybe she'll forget about that. And then there was a part of me that was just, that kind of could be interesting, but I don't know. I couldn't see myself doing that. I don't know. And fast forward quite a while, we did get married. It was about 10 years after we had gotten married. Anne reminded me of that warning that she had given me. And that's how it unfolded. I honestly do give Anne a lot of credit for me being a part of that experience, for me having that experience, because it wasn't something that I had really ever envisioned for myself. But I can say on this side, and even while I was there, I was very glad that I did do it and that we did do it as a family.
Yeah, that's incredible. That's bringing up for me not only some things I laid on the table very early on when I met my husband, which is maybe a topic for another episode,
No.
but also just we have an overlap with Nicaragua too. And I have spent time in both Managua and Leon is such a beautiful city. So that's really cool. And so as you're telling this, I'm drawing up vivid images of when I was there and was also there in the capacity of Catholicism and faith. So y'all made this first big commitment. What was it about that particular point that made you say, okay, now's the time. Now's the right time to pursue this in earnest?
I had been waiting a long time, and so I really wanted to do it as soon as possible. One of the things I wanted to do most was bring our kids and have this be an experience as a family with our kids. So we had to have kids first. So we had them. That took a couple of years because then we had one. We had to wait a couple of years. So basically that was it. It was like, okay, now after our second child was born, we decided to wait until she was a little bit older, I guess for different reasons. But one of the biggest reasons for me was I knew Maryknoll's at 3.5-year commitment. And I knew that may be as long as we would do it. I wanted both of our kids to be old enough to really remember it. I didn't want it just to be like something that Louisa kind of thought, yeah, that happened when I was a baby. I don't really remember any. So we arrived in Tanzania, she was 3.
And you really had these examples that you had encountered earlier on in your life of families that had done this with kids. I'm curious for George. Obviously, you said yes in a very big way to what had been brewing in Anne for quite some years, but who did you really look to or draw from as you approached that period?
That's a great question. Honestly, that was a bit of a challenging time for me. I didn't really have any other examples of this in my own life other than Anne. And I knew Anne had done it. I saw how clearly it affected her and how deeply moving for her the experience was in Nicaragua. And so that was inspiring to me. But it was quite different for me, such a radical change in my plans. I was baptized Catholic, but didn't really attend church at all, except for weddings and funerals and baptisms, essentially, until I was in college. And so when Anne and I were planning on getting married, I decided to go through the RCIA, or I guess it was CIA now, program. It was important to me to be able to take communion at my own wedding. So I do feel like as a younger adult and kind of through our early marriage and time together, I would say I was inspired by my church community as well. We went to a small kind of mission parish in central West Virginia. So that's where we were living when we decided to go to Maryknoll. And there were some families that were very devoted Catholics. Their children were very much involved in the church. And when we told them about our consideration for Maryknoll, they were very supportive.
Yeah, that's great. Even if this was like writ on your hearts and as part of your mission as a family, I imagine that it was a little bit daunting during that time period too, because something that you were saying, Anne, earlier about your youngest, Louisa, being able to remember it. So some people say, I'm going to delay going to the national parks till my kids remember it. But as this was a bigger journey, so to speak. How did you approach this with the kids in your own families and your own professions also that you had worked so hard to get to? What were the logistics of telling people and preparing to go as both faith-filled persons, but also professional people and parents?
I think for me, because not only did I live in Nicaragua as a young adult by myself, but also I grew up living internationally with my own family, with my own parents, not in the volunteer service capacity. So in that way, it was very different. But I did remember that. And so I think for me, that was easier. I was like, yeah, of course people move to other countries. In fact, even my dad grew up living internationally with his parents. So I actually remember talking to my grandmother who had moved to Libya with my dad and his two younger siblings by herself because my grandfather was already over there doing his work like a long time ago before there was any internet or even international phone calls and all kinds of things. And when they first moved there, I don't know, they didn't have electricity. So I remember talking to my grandma on the phone. It was great because it was like she knew what that was like. And I was telling her, we can only bring 2 suitcases, which was very different because when I moved as a child, my dad was working for a big international company. So we could bring a whole shipping container full of stuff. And I remember my grandma saying, oh, yeah, that's how it was when we moved to Libya, too. I remember trying to pack all that stuff in. And so that was nice for me. And just the logistics of, the 2 suitcases and trying to fit everything in. I remember going through all the kids' things and the toys and things and like finding like all the smallest little toys to have different options and going through their books. Our kids have always loved books. I love books. So I went through all the books and found like all the smaller like paperbacks so that they picture books so we could fit as many as possible. Yeah, so that was like a challenge, but a fun challenge to pack all that stuff up. It's just exciting for me. And professionally, it did end up being professionally a challenge for me once we were there, actually. But preparing, again, I always wanted to do international service when I decided to go to medical school. It was to become a doctor so I could go work in places where doctors were really needed all over the world. Preparing for it, honestly, was just so exciting for me. So many of my dreams were coming true. For George, it was much harder in many ways. But that was the part that was hard for me, that it was hard for George.
Yeah, again, as I mentioned earlier, my plan that my family was very well aware of was that I was going to be coming back to my home area or somewhere close to that. And where we were in West Virginia was only a few hours from that. Was actually the closest we've lived since we've been together. And the idea of us moving to a different country was quite challenging for me to figure out how to approach talking about with my parents. And it was a bit of a stressful time. It was just not understood why I would be doing something like this. And there were some family health struggles that were going on at that same time. And having that conversation during that time was definitely difficult. Over time, it got gradually better. When we first had the conversation, we didn't know what country we were going to. We had actually ranked somewhere in Central or South America, 2 different countries higher than Tanzania. In part for me, I wanted to be able to have more Spanish exposure and improve my Spanish since Anna's already fluent. And I wanted our children to have that exposure as well. We subsequently learned that Tanzania was the only place that we had ranked that we would be able to get reciprocal medical licensure through and be able to practice medicine there. But I would say professionally for me, it was also a bit challenging at first. I really enjoy my work with my patients. I really enjoy doing what I get to do every day that I work. And I had really bonded with my patients over the span of the 5 years that we were there. And so having that conversation, my coworkers and my patients, I remember there was a child one day, I'd been seeing her for 5 years, and I told her that I was going to be leaving. I was going to be doing work in a different country. And she said, But Dr. George, they have diseases there. Are you going to be safe? I said, they have diseases here too. That's why you're here to see me today. And I'm safe here. It's okay. But yeah, it was a challenge, but fast forwarding, definitely worth the challenges.
That's incredible. And what were your own kids saying? What was coming up from your kids as you were starting to talk about this in earnest?
I think that probably is one of the good things about them still being pretty young, because definitely Louisa didn't really, she was so young, she didn't really have much to say that I remember. I guess Susanna was, that she was a little bit sad. Like she was in school, she was in kindergarten, and she was sad to leave her friends and stuff. But like I was saying before, I was so happy. I was so excited. And it was such a wonderful thing for me that I think she was excited too. And doing this service as part of Maryknoll Lay Missioners, that was why we chose Maryknoll Lay Missioners, because they've always welcomed families and that they have a very strong formation program. And so before we went to Tanzania, we went to the Knoll in New York. We were there for the whole orientation. Our family actually went a little bit early so our kids could start school there. They went to a lovely Catholic Montessori, like preschool and kindergarten called Holy Name of Mary Montessori in Croton-on-Hudson, New York. They were so nice and so welcoming. That was a great experience for the kids. They loved it. They went to that school together. And there was another family in our orientation class who had also two girls who were a little younger than ours, but that was really nice. They played together, and I think it was a really positive experience for our kids getting ready. And then when we got to Tanzania too, our Maryknoll community there that was very welcoming. The things that was stressful for us too were probably stressful for them, like saying goodbye to our families. And even my parents, they weren't happy about it. They obviously were sad that we were going very far. So that part was hard for all of us.
Taking away the grandkids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Although we brought them back and we visited several times. I do remember the day that we found out that we were going to Mwanza, to Tanzania. Susanna had a very kind of intense initial reaction. I think maybe because we had talked about going to a Spanish-speaking country, I'm not sure. It was also the same day that we had a massive flood in our town, and there was a bunch of people up in our driveway because we lived up on a hill, and we had no power or water, and we were all standing out in the driveway talking when we got the phone call that we were being sent to East Africa, to Tanzania. And so it was a surreal experience seeing the river running in front of our house where we didn't have waterfront property before, and seeing all of our neighbors, all the stuff going on in our town, the uncertainties of a big flood, and then learning such a big life-changing thing at that same time. It was an emotional day for sure. But that was like the only day I think that there was like the experience. And then it was, then we knew where we were going, and that took the uncertainty out of it. Then the question for me anyway became more, how am I going to practice medicine in Swahili?
I'm interested to get to that. So you went through the kind of formation process before you left and had all the hard goodbyes and had the excitement of going, and then you finally land in Tanzania. There's probably so much you could say about those first weeks, but what has stayed with you in terms of the challenging and the surprising or the positive? What has stayed with you about those first weeks of transition?
I remember very clearly when we arrived in the Mwanza airport after like several different flights and layovers and like a very long time of travel with our two quite young children. I remember this image so clearly. We had the whole pile of our suitcases because we had 8 suitcases for the 4 of us. And we had the car booster seat for Louisa. And we were all just exhausted. And then we were like standing in this kind of like small kind of room that we had walked in from the tarmac, and it was hot. George and I were sitting there trying to figure out like how to get like our entry visa. And it was just like a very small airport and very like a little window. People were speaking Swahili, and I just looked at the big pile of bags and our 2 kids that were just both like slumped over tired, like sleeping on top of the bags. And I do remember having a sense like, oh no, what have we gotten ourselves into? But then after that, that was the hardest part because we had to do that part on our own. But then once we got through and we could go out the airport, then our Maryknoll community was there to welcome us. And from that point on, then they were always there to support and help us. But it was just that moment that was like, oh my gosh, what do we do?
We do have a couple pictures that periodically pop up on my phone. One of the airports, we were on a layover and the girls were sitting on each side of me. And by that point, we had already been traveling, I don't know, something like 15, 18 hours. And we all had these like very harried looks on our faces. I share that kind of initial sentiment that Anne just painted very nicely. There was this feeling of, wow, this is an airport surrounded by dirt and I don't understand what people are saying to me. And one of the kids was like sitting on the booster seat, like half awake, and we were like pulling them along. But once we got out and we had some conversations with some of our fellow Tanzania lay missioners, we knew them a little bit. And so getting to actually see them and having them like grab our bags and load the things up into the pickup truck and drive us to where we were going to be staying. We stayed with the other family who had 2 young children, actually very close to our children's ages, at their home for, I guess, about a week or 10 days. And they showed us kind of the ins and outs of this is what life is like and this is what you do. And the kids actually took it really in stride. And I remember we were there a total of, I think, 2, maybe 3 days. And the young woman that helped in the care of this family's children was helping us with our kids too a bit as we were trying to figure things out. And Louisa, in her little 3-year-old self, just toddled over to the woman and just reached up for her to pick her up and hugged her right away. I was like, oh, okay, maybe this is going to be okay. It was just something that stuck with me. It was a really sweet moment.
Louisa, the little diplomat. I love it. Yeah, so you had what sounds like people who acted as a bridge and really welcomed you with open arms and received you and just let you be for a little bit. How was living on your own? I can't recall if you started your work right away or what was daily life like and kids and schools and all that good stuff.
One of the things that I just value so much about Maryknoll lay missioners is, like I was saying, the formation beforehand and also the language training. Like all Maryknoll lay missioners spend like their first 3 to 4 months in country in full-time language training. So that was our full-time work at that time. So George and I did 4 months of full-time Swahili studies, and there was a Swahili language school in another community where some other lay missioners lived that usually people went to for language school. But so our kids could be in school, and the only international school was in Mwanza. There wasn't an international school in that other place. The community, before we came, arranged for a teacher who was like retired from that language school to come and teach us, just me and George together. So that was really fun. So she came to our house actually, and we sat out on the porch and had like a table and had our books and our things we were studying. And she came and taught us every day. And that was great. She was wonderful. And that was one of the highlights for me of the beginning of our time there, because I love languages. I was so excited. I was so excited to get to learn a totally new language in Swahili. It's such a different language. It was so much fun for me to learn it. And our teacher was just lovely. The language school where she had previously taught had been run, I think, maybe by Maryknoll in the past. Anyway, it's like a Catholic language school. And so she herself was a devout Catholic. And so that was fun too, because she taught us from the book, the curriculum from the school, but actually even that had some like different Catholic things in it. She brings her missal in Swahili and things to us and teach us how to say things. And she even used examples. I remember she would say, for example, in the parable where Jesus says this and this. So it was fun. I'd never learned language through the Catholic prism before. So that was really fun. She was just a lovely teacher. So that was certainly a highlight for me. And that was our everyday life for the first 4 months for me and George.
Yeah, Magdalena, our teacher, is really a special person. She was also very, very sweet with our kids whenever they would come home from school or whatever. Bibi is grandmother in Swahili, and she was Bibi Magdalena, come greet Bibi, and she would say to them, and we had lunch with her every day that she was with us. The language training was really the training with her, and then also the lived training when you're going out to the market. That ended up being one of my tasks, was often going to the market and learning. So I got really good very early on with market Swahili, but the rest of it took a lot more time. We fell into a little bit of the other expat community too. Once we were there, we learned about a significant number of other families who were in missions of various sort that had their kids there as well. And we got to know a lot of families. That was a nice experience as well. I think that was good for us with our kids as well. The story about how long it took to start practicing was a bit more protracted. We had a bunch of rather significant difficulty with getting our medical licensure and our documents. The internet infrastructure is sometimes good and sometimes less. And there were definitely times where, like we actually had to go and meet with people like in various places to follow up on things that theoretically would have been done electronically. The culmination of that was me taking a 10-hour bus ride to another section of the country, going to where the medical offices were. And in the meantime, unfortunately, having my phone stolen and some other things happen, and hiring somebody to drive me to where they think my phone was. And it was a bit of a fiasco. I survived. I got my phone back
Oh, wow.
in the end, but I left that day with the documents. And then we were able to start practicing. But it wasn't for lack of trying that it took about 9 months for us to get all of our documentation so we could practice.
That's like a journey inside of the journey. Wow, that's incredible. What was practicing like in Tanzania? Can you talk a little bit about what your goals were project-wise or things that you found interesting in terms of the differences? Obviously, a different resourced environment. What were some of the things that have stayed with you about your medical practice while you were there?
For me, that was probably the most difficult thing about being there because I didn't have a really clear role in my job. A lot of time I didn't feel useful at all. George and I both worked for our main jobs 3 days a week. We traveled together. We drove together about an hour outside of the city of Mwanza where we lived to a small hospital that was a Catholic hospital of the Archdiocese of Mwanza in a small fishing village right on the shore of Lake Victoria. George was asked to run the children's ward. So he was pretty busy running the children's ward. I was asked to be the doctor for the reproductive and child health center, which was like an outpatient clinic that was part of the hospital for pregnancy care, prenatal checkups, and checkups for children under 5. Like the routine prenatal checkups and the routine like children's checkups and vaccines and weight checks. Those were all done by the nurse midwives. So they didn't need me to do any of that routine care, which was fine. They had a system for that. But the medical director of the hospital told me by like national standard or the requirements for the reproductive and child health center standards, they were supposed to have a doctor or a clinical officer there on site to do consults for any of the patients who had any problems, if they were sick when they came in, or a child wasn't gaining weight right, or the pregnant mother had high blood pressure or anything like that was abnormal. So that was supposed to be my job. And I did that. Part of the challenge was like the funding, the way care was funded, because this is a private hospital owned by the Catholic diocese. So it wasn't part of the Tanzanian national health system. So for most services, patients had to pay fees, but some of the services were funded through like the government Ministry of Health. So the prenatal checkups and like prenatal vitamins and things like that, the routine medicines and things were paid for by government funding, and also the vaccines and like the weight checkups for children under 5, all of that was paid for. So patients could get that for free. So everybody could come for those, and people did come. They were pretty busy. But then if a pregnant person had high blood pressure, for example, they could see me and they wouldn't be charged like a doctor visit fee. But for medicine or lab tests, they would have to pay for those. Or if a child came in for their weight checkup, but they were also like having a fever, then they could see me. I could do the appointment and examine them. But then if I ordered a malaria test, they'd have to pay for that. And then if they had malaria, they'd have to pay for the medicine. So that side of things was much less busy because a lot of the people in that community were either fishermen or subsistence farming. So far as I could tell, most of the people who lived in that town called Bukumbi the majority were subsistence farmers. So they didn't have any money. So they couldn't pay even a small amount. So like some days I would see very few or no patients, and maybe not because there wasn't people who needed a consult, but there was nobody who could pay for the medicine and the tests, and people don't really want to come if they can't get the medicine and the tests. So then I felt like very frustrated because I knew there were people who needed care, but I couldn't give it to them because I was in this system where they couldn't afford it. So that was very hard. But I think part of like my spiritual growth during that time to feel like I wasn't able to be useful, and people that I met too that were so patient. So many people in Tanzania just seemed to wait so patiently. And like George and I were so frustrated waiting for so long for our license. But then we were seeing people coming for their appointment with their sick child, maybe waiting hours to be seen or something, and not seeming to be impatient about it at all. So yeah, I think it was definitely part of my spiritual growth. It was a big challenge for me.
Yeah. And before we go to George and how his practice was going, one question I had come up. So with tests and medications they couldn't afford, was there any financial relief there through the Catholic system?
Yes, they did do some donated care, but it was limited because what was explained to me that the hospital's funding was limited, a funding shortfall for some reason that I'm not sure what it was. And for a couple months, like the hospital staff didn't get paid, which was horrible. It was a real strain for all of the other hospital staff. Almost all of them was Tanzanian, the Tanzanian nurses and nurses' aides and like the cleaners, and they weren't getting a paycheck. Our coworkers were really in difficult situation there. Yeah, so the hospital really depended on a lot of the money to run the hospital and to pay, mainly to pay their salaries, which is the biggest cost on patient fees. So they limited the kind of donated care to like very extreme situations, people who are really living in like desperate poverty and had a desperate need for the care. They would give free care in those kind of situations. But like I said, so many of the people living there were subsistence farmers. So there were a lot of people who didn't really have much cash on hand. And I think the hospital couldn't necessarily afford to give out free care to all the people. It was a hard situation.
Yeah. George, turning direction to you, it sounds like you were quite busy. Is that because a lot of the care you provided was covered by that government safety?
There was some
Government funding.
government
Yeah,
funding. It was still quite challenging. One of the things that I struggled with, I think the most working in that hospital, was not being able to care for the patients the way that I wanted to sometimes. Before they could leave the hospital, they had to pay their bill.
Oh, yeah.
And if they couldn't pay one day, they would then have to stay another night and have to pay another night's hospital bed. And so what we found was people were very nervous about being admitted and were very keen to leave early if possible so that they could afford to leave before their bill got too high. And because of the small amount of resources that our hospital had, I guess is one way to put it, we didn't have any sort of intensive care coverage. And so we would send kids or send patients to the city being Mwanza, about an hour away from us, for stepping up the care. But that was very frequently cost prohibitive for the families. And so I definitely saw several children die because they couldn't make the trip. They couldn't afford the trip. Or by the time they got the funding to make the trip, it was too late. So that was a very difficult thing for me to swallow, a different way of experiencing what Anne said, like not feeling as useful. And like, I'm here, I'm trying to do this, and it still feels like I'm not able to do what I came to do or what I wanted to do. So that was challenging. One thing that was a lifeline for us, there was an Italian woman who worked at the hospital running the HIV care and treatment center, who existed primarily all on donations. She had a huge support system back in Italy, or at least it seemed that way. And so when we were stuck and it's okay, the family cannot afford this, or the hospital is out of this medication and we really need this for the kid, do you have it? She had a huge heart and was very willing to be supportive and help us out and help the kids out. I felt like she was a bit of a lifeline for us, for me at least, in care of the kids when things got really tough sometimes. We talk about the hospital being a resource in a resource poor setting. Being able to get testing depended on if the machines were working that day and if the lab reagents were in date, or did the power fail and they got too warm and they're no good anymore, because we frequently had minimal power. Some days we didn't have water in the hospital. The water system would fail. Over time, you take it in stride. You're doing this for a prolonged period of time, but it was still just so humbling to me to watch the hospital staff and the patients just kind of, okay, yeah, that's what's going on today. Yeah, we don't have water today. This is what we do. And they just rolled with it. And in the US, if the water failed in a system where I was working, they'd close the building for the day. And that just wasn't an option where we were. It just kept going. Yeah, so that was intense.
I appreciated everything you've said about the medical system because my public health brain is geeking out hard on these challenges. But my spiritual brain is also latching on to a theme that I feel like comes up a lot when you commit yourself to service and solidarity. And for me, I did 2 years of post-grad service in teaching. And while it wasn't the same contextual, limited, resourced environment that you're talking about, those feelings of, am I really being helpful? Am I really being useful? Is something that I think reverberates a lot through people that make bold decisions. At least for me, and I can only speak for myself, when you make a bold decision, you oftentimes imagine yourself having this commensurate, bold impact, or you have this idea in your head of what all this effort to get there, to have some idea in my head of the change that I had hoped to make. And you used that word humbling, George, and you both talked about just watching families have patience and watching staff have resourcefulness and how powerful that was for you. What do you think that speaks to spiritually, or do you remember anything spiritually that helped you? Do you ever feel like you really ever fully turned the corner on that, or where were the moments of wisdom?
Yes, that's a good point, Christina. I had never really thought about it like that, that it's a huge undertaking to go somewhere and prepare to be able to do the service. And then maybe that makes one think, I must do something huge when I'm there. And certainly people talk about that. I'd ask, is it really worth it? That's a lot of resources that goes into you and your family getting there. And did I ever really turn the corner on that? I don't think I still have, because even though I work in a hospital now with lots of resources, I'm still powerless to help a lot of my patients with a lot of their struggles, as you with your public health expertise well know in the US as well. A couple things for me that were helpful. One, I think, was my formation as a Jesuit volunteer, because a lot of the Jesuit spirituality when I did my Jesuit volunteer formation was about that accompaniment is powerful. The spirituality of accompaniment, I think, and I've seen that in my own experience and heard from other people too, that a lot of times what touches people or is meaningful to people, it's not necessarily just what specific thing I can do for them or that any of us can do, but the fact that we cared enough to just go be there. I've learned about that kind of intellectually, and then I've really seen it. I've heard people say, wow, you came all the way here. That's is meaningful. And I guess it makes sense. It's like when someone comes to your birthday party, it's meaningful that they came for you, not that they're bringing you a nice present. I guess we all really know that just another human showing up for us, being there or coming, making the effort to come is really meaningful. So that kind of spirituality of accompaniment for people like us from a very wealthy, privileged country and our own wealthy, privileged background as doctors, having all the resources and comforts. We still had plenty of resources and comforts in Monza, but not all the same ones. I think choosing to go, like the wonderful Pope Francis called us to go to the margins, right? And in our own small way, we were trying to do that. And the other thing that really helped me also during that whole time, I always felt so lucky to be part of a faith-based community like Maryknoll. As George said, we knew other like foreigners who were there in different capacities, and friends I knew there or knew from other places who were doing like international global work or service or development work, and sometimes found it really depressing. So hard to see the point sometimes, and felt like, what's the point of what we're doing? We're not really helping anyone. Sometimes we might be making things worse. This is horrible. So I just felt so lucky because I had always had this and still have this kind of like connection to something deeper. The ultimate thing that's important is not what we're doing, but there's a deeper meaning and a deeper thing that ties us all together as parts of God's creation, all humans, even the people in Tanzania that I never understood. They never understood me. I felt like there was this chasm between me and people I was, meeting there so many times, but on a different level, I still knew that we had that connection. And when I forgot that, our Maryknoll community would also bring us back to that in different ways. I think that's just invaluable to have that deeper level of meaning and reason for being there. It's like I didn't have to have a logical explanation for being there because I had a different kind of explanation for being there.
I think for me, it was that moment of the time where I felt honestly the most useless or paralyzed by a system trying to do what I wanted to do and not being able to do it, and having this feeling like we moved here and I can't even practice medicine and I can't get my license. And I just remember having these conversations with Anne, and Anne was a tremendous support for me at that time, encouraging me to allow myself to be open to the accompaniment part of it. And while she talks about that being a challenge for her as well, I honestly feel like she didn't show it nearly as much as I did. She was very supportive of me and getting me through that. For me, there were a few things that while we were learning our language and learning Swahili and waiting for the documentation to come through for us to practice, I had been placed in a group that was started by a Maryknoll affiliated organization. One of the priests from Maryknoll started the parent group, but it was a group for kids with families of children with special needs. And so it was children with cerebral palsy and spina bifida and hydrocephalus, and some of them very neurologically impaired. But this organization brought them together to do a support group for the parents and do some therapy for the children, physical therapy in particular. And they brought me on initially to learn healthcare based Swahili, but then they also had me be a part of the group. So I would just sit there and listen in the support group and just hear the parents talk about the challenges they were facing and the things that they were doing and the stigma that they faced having a special needs child, and the difficulties in a terrain that was definitely not easily navigable by foot, let alone by wheelchair, and how they just welcomed me in, and I had tea and treats with them every day that I went, and I was another part of the group. And then another group that I was a part of was a group for kids with spina bifida and cerebral palsy and hydrocephalus specifically. And when I showed up at the house where they were staying for any kind of care and any kind of support for them, they were always so grateful and so kind and so sweet. I would leave there thinking, did I really change anything? Did I really provide any medical care? But it was just the accompaniment piece, really. And a lot of the time I felt like they were being listened to and somebody really cared that they were struggling and needed help. When I really was struggling at times, I feel incredibly blessed to have had the opportunity to go on retreat there a few different times. There was a priest and a Maryknoll lay missioner who started something called the Lake House of Prayer that was built around like silent meditation and bringing quiet to your day-to-day life and contemplative retreat. And they established the Lake House of Prayer for all comers. And so they would have workers in the community who needed to get away. And just for a day, their idea was to provide retreat for anybody. And so we had several times as lay missioners that we went there as a group for a weekend retreat. And for me, that was one of the most kind of recharging, amazing things that just really brought me back to the realization that it didn't really matter why I was there, but more that I was there. And I am really grateful for that.
And also we got to do spiritual direction at the Lake House of Prayer too. George and I were able to start doing that like once a month. That was also a really good support, I think, for both of us. We were able to set up where we would go up together, and then that was really helpful too.
Really hearing you both talk about this again, it's bringing me back to my own examples of service. And when I was in Nicaragua, I was in a home with kids with special needs, and a lot of them were in wheelchairs. And I remember they gave me a rag and just told me to swat flies when they landed on the kids. And I remember thinking like, oh man, you didn't ask me to do anything else. But they were like, no, this is what we need you to do. Or I think of Jim O'Donnell, who did the medical care with homeless folks in Boston. And he showed up very well versed in medicine and so many things, and they gave him a bowl and said, start washing people's feet. It's like foot care among the homeless is where it all starts, and here's your bowl and here's your rag. And he talks about that moment for him. And I love that you tie that into what you had available to you on a faith level, because as someone who's also very concerned about social justice, without my faith, I think for me it would be a lot harder to get to those places of realization and wisdom about our common humanity and why we are there and all those things. I want to switch gears a little bit because I know our time is not limitless, which I regret. Two other questions I wanted to ask you were, what were the kids doing during this time? What were they doing? And what was it like to go to church? And what was your faith like as a family?
Oh, yeah. Going to church, that was fun because at first I thought I want to go to Mass in Swahili. That will help me learn Swahili because I know what the Mass is. Occasionally we did go to some Masses in Swahili, but we found out that Masses in Tanzania, the Swahili Masses are really long. And I guess the homily is like super, super long. And I thought, our kids already don't necessarily love going to Mass. So now I'm going to tell them they have to come to the 2.5-hour Mass and sit through the homily will be like an hour and they won't understand it at all. They may like leave the Catholic Church and never come back. So then we found out there was a Mass in English. It was a Jesuit parish in the city of Monza, and the pretty good sized Jesuit community. I think there were like 6 or 8 Jesuits, and most of them were African Jesuits from different African countries. But one was this wonderful Jesuit from Boston who had lived many years in Indonesia and also in the Middle East. And he's an amazing guy. And then he was teaching at the Jesuit University outside of Monza. And he lived in that community and he celebrated Mass in English every Sunday. So we started going to his Mass. And I mean, there were some other people from the US and other countries that went, but most of the people who went were Tanzanians. We got to know him very well because then he'd be like, hey, and he was very friendly. He was very friendly to everyone. He was such a nice guy. And I'm still in touch with him because he's wonderful. So that was great. Even that Mass was different than other Masses, but it was in English. Our kids understood it. It was also cool because Susanna got to make her first communion when we were there. And there was another family that joined Maryknoll while we were there. And they had 3 kids and their younger child was Susanna's age. So they were both going to celebrate their first communion. And Father Jim, the Jesuit, we asked him about it, like if he would, like, could they do a first communion in English and preparation in English? And I said, I'll help out if you need help or whatever. So he put this thing together and he basically taught most of the prep. He was like enthusiastic about it. And I think it was like maybe 6 or 8 kids when they had their first communion. They planned the whole thing and it was great. It was like a very special and unique experience, I think, for Susanna and our family, a very different way to celebrate her first communion than if we had just stayed in West Virginia for her.
I too enjoyed the Masses at Nyakahoja, the church that we went to. And Father Jim is a very entertaining guy. He's He was a good friend. So your other question about what the kids were doing, they went to a school called the Isamilo International School. It was an international school on the Cambridge curriculum. While we were there, it was virtual learning because of COVID, but most of the time when we were there, we would drive them there in the morning, and one of the other families would carpool with us. And in addition to their classes, they also would tell stories about the monkeys stealing their sandwiches or their lunches. And they thought it was great that they had to have monkey-proof trash cans on the school campus. And Susanna got into the choir. They briefly had a choir teacher there, and Susanna got excited about that and joined that.
And they got to swim.
And and that actually is
Really
one of the
nice.
things that
Really well.
they learned to swim very well, because where we were in Tanzania, it was nearly 75 to 85 degrees year round. There were a few different coaches, and one of the people who directed it was an expat from the US. It was called the Mwanza Swim Club, and our kids got very good. And that was their big extracurricular activity, and they got quite fit, quite good in the water, and actually continued that a fair amount after we got back to the US for a while.
And that was at their school. That was one of the advantages, because their school had this swimming pool, which was an outdoor, it's pretty basic swimming pool. It's not fancy. So even like Louisa, when she started preschool there, even the preschool kids went one day a week. They would go, and like in the shallow end, they would teach them swimming. It was great. I've always felt really happy. That was an extra perk.
Yeah.
Our kids got to be really good swimmers, because then I never had to worry about them if we were at the beach or something. I was really happy for them to get to go to an international school, because I got to go to an international school when I was growing up. And I always thought that was such a wonderful experience. And I wish more kids could have that, to get to go to school with other kids from all over the world, and teachers from all over the world too. Our kids had teachers from lots of different places, both in Africa and Europe and US. I think that's really special. It reminded me in some ways of my childhood, although this school was very different from the school I went to, but some things were the same, like kids in different places, and like the school lunch option at the school canteen. The lunch lady who like ran the canteen was Indian, because it was like an Indian community in Mwanza, Indian Tanzanians who had been there for generations. And she was really good cook. So it was like this delicious Indian food. And Susanna really loved it, especially. She'd always get the school lunch, and she was like, "Oh, I love Miss Darcy's lentil dal. It's so great." Much better than the cafeteria food in Durham.
What did you have for lunch today? Oh, I had biryani.
I love that. Oh my gosh. Yeah, way better than I think what commonly gets served here. I know we're closing our conversation, and the talk about swimming actually reminds me of what I hope we can end on, which is, besides swimming prowess and high expectations for school lunch, what did you as a family unit really leave with that you think has contributed to your ongoing faith formation?
One of the things that I value so much about our time as Maryknoll lay missioners is that we as a family were part, and actually are still part, of this incredible body of people who all share a commitment to service based on faith, and are living that out in all different ways, and are from all different like backgrounds, and of all different ages in particular. I really loved that. And I think that is something really unique that our family otherwise didn't have a chance to be part of. Definitely the fact that we're still part of that community. Like last year, we got to go and be part of the Jubilee celebration of Berry.It lay missioners, and meet with people that we knew from our time in mission, and other people that we hadn't met before who had done mission service in different times and places, and with our kids as well. I feel so happy that we were able to give our kids that experience, to see people of different ages, different professions, but choosing to live their life in service and faith-based service. I think our kids will be able to carry that with them for their lives.
Two things, and this is largely around the kids, but I think it was eye-opening for me as well. One was, we were cautioned to be careful not to give out money and things like that, because the needs were endless. And we were there to help meet needs, but in other ways. So one day we were leaving church, and somebody asked us for money, and I said, "I'm sorry, I can't." And we left, and one of the children said, but Daddy, we can help them. We can afford it. And so there were these little small, I guess, equivalent of a 10-cent bag of little roasted peanuts that you could get at the market. They were along the sides of the road everywhere people were selling them. And so we would stock up our peanut bags in our glove box of our car. And when we would leave every Sunday from Mass, the kids would roll down the windows and hand out the bags of peanuts to all the people who were waiting. And they really wanted to do something. They saw a need and wanted to do it in their own little way. And I loved that. And I still see that kind of in them now, like how they want to help other people who are in need. Again, that kind of desire for service and that drive to do it. And I also see my kids, and I see myself this way as well. Now, I'm so grateful that my children got to be raised for 3 years in a completely different culture, something completely different than their own. They were the outsiders coming in. And while it wasn't always perfect, feeling the acceptance of being an outsider coming in, I see them now so much more just willing to just accept people for who they are. And for many of us, there's the human tendency to judge whether we should or not. They're so much more willing and so much more able to, I feel like, meet people where they are or see people for who they are and accept them. And I'm really grateful that they got that lesson early on.
Wow. That is powerful, and what a beautiful note to conclude with. And my hope in doing this series is that not everybody will move abroad and do service as a family, but you talking about how these experiences were formative, and I think families can seek experiences like that even in their own neighborhood, and it will continue to form them as this has formed you. And what a gift your example of doing this will be to, I think, many who are listening and who will say, maybe I can do something like that. Maybe we can be outsiders somewhere and learn some of the humility and love and acceptance of community. So I really want to thank you all. And if you have any final words, please do share.
My final word is, there's some things I really love about being Catholic. And one of the things is that the special place in our faith, I think, that we have for mystery, because the spirituality of accompaniment and just going and being with people, that is enough, and that is worth it. But then on the other hand, that, like you were talking about, because there's social justice and public health, and so many of our patients and the people that we met there, they're suffering injustices that don't have to be that way. And we want to change them. And I'm saying one thing, but then how can those things both be true? I'm just there to accompany people, but these things are wrong and they have to change. People are suffering. And then I think it's okay, because those are both true. And so I'm like, oh, I'm so glad I'm Catholic, because we can just be like, maybe it's a mystery. I don't understand how they can both be true, and that's okay.
And what a better thing to learn, especially early on and in the family, than to be able to sit with that, and to learn how to navigate it in the context of faith. Anne and George, thank you so much for sharing so intimately the details of your journey and how it affected your family and your faith. And I know that many people will appreciate these moments and these bits of wisdom for many days to come.
Thank you very much.